My name is John Romero. I'm a retired district court judge of the Children's Court Division in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a proud member of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges since about 2003 or 2004. As many of you know, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges is an 87-year-old judges organization, and not just judges, but attorneys and others who want to join, but it's dedicated to providing juvenile and family court judges and other stakeholders with training tools to improve a collaborative response that may be necessary to enhance services to our families and to our children. Beginning almost 14 years ago, in 2011, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges Board acknowledged and addressed the need to work with civilian court judges and military folks to address the issue of judicial education on military issues and collaboration. That led to a national summit on courts and military connected families in what was then named Fort Benning, Georgia. That happened in 2015. There was a second summit at Fort Knox, Kentucky in 2019. Much of the work that the National Council has been doing through its military committee has resulted in the National Resource Center on Military Connected Families and the Courts. That's included on the National Council's website, a very useful resource. Additionally, on that same website is a judicial resource guide on military families and the courts. Yesterday, as we all know, was Veterans Day. It's appropriate that this presentation today, connecting the dots on military and civilian family courts, animal abuse links to other family violence, is taking place today. And we're very honored to have Phil Arco presenting. He's with and is the National Link Coalition. It's a nonprofit, multidisciplinary collaborative initiative that's designed to increase awareness and address public policy programs and research. The coalition also serves as the National Resource Center on the link between animal abuse and human violence. If you are not aware of the link letter that comes out every month, I think that's about almost a 6,000 person circulation internationally, not just in the United States. For those of you who are interested, just log on to the website for the National Link Coalition. It doesn't cost anything to get that newsletter, full of very valuable information. Phil Arco is a internationally acclaimed lecturer, author, and educator. He's the president and secretary of the National Link Coalition, and we are very honored, and it's my pleasure on behalf of the National Council to welcome Phil to his presentation on connecting the dots on military and civilian family courts, animal abuses linked to other family violence. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, John, and I'm honored to have our very close relationship between us at the National Link Coalition and the National Council. John neglected to mention that he serves on our professional advisory committee, as do Rosa Figueroa in Miami and Joey Orduna Hastings in Reno. And we're very proud of our interlocking relationship there with the National Council. As John mentioned, we're the National Resource Center on this link between animal abuse and other forms of family violence, which is summarized by the Venn circle there on the screen. There are four forms of family violence. And most people working in family law, family courts, social services only think of three. They only think of child abuse, domestic violence, and elder abuse. What they don't realize is that animal abuse is a critical component of that, and they overlap. And anybody working in any of these fields can see and encounter multiple forms of family violence and not realize that they are all linked and they all connect. I'm going to talk about that and particularly how it affects the court system, not only for military courts, but also civilian courts, and show some of the issues that affect military families. We'll take questions and answers at the end. So please, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. Again, feel free to visit our website, nationallinkcoalition.org, or there's our email, my email address there. Email me if you have any questions, need more information, or would like to subscribe to our free monthly link letter. Need to tell you a little bit about how I got here and some of the light bulb moments that put the link on my radar screen. I started out as a newspaper reporter. I was in Colorado Springs, Colorado, where we had a lot of military presence. And I went from newspaper reporting to the local Humane Society in Colorado Springs, where we were taking in 60 animals a day. And many of them came in from military families. We had Fort Carson on the Army side, Air Force, we had the Air Force Academy, NORAD, which became Space Command, Peterson Air Force Base. And several things happened. This is way back in the 1970s and 1980s that got me and a number of my colleagues around the country thinking differently about animal cruelty issues. One of those issues was a research study that crossed my desk from my alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania, where a woman in the School of Social Work took a year's worth of data from the Child Protection Agency in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. That's the county just north of Philly. And the Bucks County SPCA, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and looked at their caseloads for 1 year and found in 9% of the cases they overlapped. Child protection and animal protection were dealing with the same families. They were dealing with family violence, but they weren't talking to each other. They were in silos. They had their blinders on. And I thought that's something pretty odd about that because, as I'll show you in a minute, the child protection field came out of animal protection. For 80 years, they were combined. And now here they were all these years later, not talking to each other. And I thought, what's wrong with that picture? About the same time, I was doing an in-service training for teachers. And I brought a local veterinarian in to talk to them about pet care. And at the time, I was the only delegate from the humane movement within the American Veterinary Medical Association. I was on their animal welfare committee. And I had a light bulb moment. I said, Doc, every teacher in this room is required by Colorado law to report suspected child abuse. They're called mandated reporters. And I know everybody in human health is a mandated reporter of child abuse. But what about animal health? What about veterinarians? Do you have to report suspected animal abuse? I'm sorry, do you have to report suspected child abuse? He thought a minute. He said, as a matter of fact, I do. Colorado is the only state in the country that had the foresight to realize that veterinarians might, in fact, see abused children. In 49 states, it wasn't on their radar screen. And I always attribute that to Colorado's altitude. You know, we can see farther out there, and people often get to be much more progressive about many things. I said, that's interesting. Let me take that one step further. Would you have to report animal cruelty to us at the Humane Society? He said, no, why would I ever want to do that? I might lose a client. And I thought, what's wrong with that picture? Shouldn't the veterinarian be at least as proactive in responding to animal abuse as pediatricians are in responding to child abuse? And then a little bit after that, I was the after dinner speaker at our local domestic violence shelter's annual meeting in Colorado Springs. And I was waiting to go on, and I needed to learn a little bit about this organization. I knew nothing about the domestic violence field. And I'm opening up one of their newsletters, and there on page 3 are 4 drawings that have been drawn by the children in the shelters. And 3 of the 4 pictures were of animals that have been hurt or killed by daddy's or mommy's abusive boyfriend as a way to warn them that if he disobeyed them, he would hurt the animals and they would be next. And this was a whole new aspect of animal abuse that nobody had ever really given much thought to, that in fact, animal abuse had a close connection, or now what we call a link, with domestic violence. Well, fast forward to 2008, and 25 of us who'd been working in this area got together and formed the National Link Coalition. And there are many nonprofits out there that address domestic violence or child abuse or elder abuse or animal cruelty. We're really the only one that links all 4 of them. And as John mentioned, we've got over 5,600 readers of our free link letter. There's our contact information. Again, feel free to subscribe. There's no cost to it. We work when showcasing great programs. We look at public policy. We got 140 some odd bills we're monitoring right now. We build awareness through training programs like this. And we substantiate all this by compiling research. We've got over 2,350 references in our bibliography. and we're setting up local link coalitions. The goal of all this is to take a multidisciplinary approach and combine the limited resources of these four sectors to make safer communities. And of course, the courts play a huge role in this. The link connects the dots. And as I said earlier, these four forms of family violence have often operated in silos, and animal cruelty has always been on the periphery because legislators and funders and government officials and social services always think, hey, people are more important than animals. What they don't realize is that there is this connection. And those of us in the animal protection field assumed the human services field was together, but in fact they weren't. It wasn't until the early 1990s that the first national conference was held on the impact of domestic violence on children. And it was about the same time people began to realize that elder abuse affects older couples as well. It's not just young families. But again, the animal protection side was, was excluded. The link brings them all together. And again, there's that diagram again, connects the dots. And what it shows is that when animals are abused, people are at risk. And when people are abused, animals are at risk. It's really just as simple as that. We've identified 8 distinct types of links, and any of these can wind up in your courts. The most prevalent form is this domestic violence connection, which is all about power and control, in which the abuser, who's usually a man, and the victim is usually a woman, not always, as we know, we have women who abuse men, we have intimate partner violence and same-sex relationships. But the abuser harms or threatens the animals as a way to trap the family, hold them hostage, keep them from leaving. It's a case of emotional extortion. And I need to update those numbers. Most recent survey, 97% of women calling the National Domestic Violence Hotline say fear for their animals is an important consideration as to whether they're going to leave, and 50% will not leave if their animals aren't, taken care of. We have this similar emotional extortion in child sexual abuse, where the abuser warns the little boy or little girl that if they talk about what happens, he's going to strangle her bunny, or his bunny. And now, on top of all the trauma and emotional distress and physical pain and everything and confusion, everything else this child is going through, he or she now has to worry about saving the life of a beloved pet. We have the concept of adverse childhood experiences, early traumatic experiences in children's lives, which leads to long-term physical and emotional issues there. The ACEs study that created this concept many years ago completely ignored the impact of children's witnessing or committing acts of animal cruelty, which is equally devastating. And what we found is that a child's committing animal cruelty is one of the earliest indicators of conduct disorder. It starts showing up at about the age of 6.5. We have the issue of bullying. It's not just youths who bully others, who, as you would expect, are more aggressive towards animals. It's youths who have been bullied, take all that negative energy that's been directed at them and redirect it at creatures lower on the totem pole. We have the issue of animal hoarding, which can affect any age group, but it tends to be elderly, isolated women, and it's often linked with elder abuse and many, many other social service and psychological issues and community issues. I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a bit. We have dogfighting and cockfighting, which is not only horrible for the animals, but it's very strongly linked with a wide range of other crimes: narcotics offenses, weapons offenses, sex trafficking, homicides, racketeering, you name it. This mass shooters, latest figures suggest that about 10% of them have been torturing animals. It's a tremendous risk factor for mass shooters, and the FBI and Homeland Security are very interested in that dynamic there. And then the most disgusting area of the link is animal sexual abuse. Most states call it bestiality, but we're trying to think of it in these terms here. There are people out there who prefer to have sex with animals. There are dark web websites. There's animal pornography online. What we find when we do a raid on animal pornography is almost invariably child pornography linked with it as well, and also children being forced to have sex with animals as a way to groom them for child sexual abuse. Animal abuse is the tip of the iceberg. It's not only child abuse, elder abuse, and domestic violence, but other forms of social concerns, alcoholism, substance abuse, marital problems, unemployment, financial concerns. And the fact is, the animal abuse usually is the first point of contact from law enforcement or social service agencies because it often occurs outdoors where their neighbors can see it, and they know that the dog can't pick up the phone and dial 911. So whoever investigates animal abuse in a community is a first responder and often uncovers these other issues. If we intervene early and recognize that animal abuse suggests something else is probably wrong in that household, that can be the first step in stopping the cycles of violence. Why should courts take animal abuse seriously? Why are we making such a big deal about this? Well, for starters, the U.S. has the great distinction of having the world's oldest anti-cruelty laws. They were enacted in the Massachusetts Bay Colony as early as 1641. And then, as now, they were rooted in the concept of being a crime against property. It's not a case of animals having rights, because in the legal sense, they do not. They are property, they are chattel property, and probably will always be so. But even so, these laws are there to protect property and public morality. As early as 1649, we have found cases of courts prosecuting co-occurring cases of animal abuse and child abuse. Animal abuse is a crime, flat out, okay, in every single state. It often indicates or predicts other issues. We can't excuse it by saying, oh, it was only a squirrel or boys will be boys. It's not a normal rite of passage. As I said, it's one of the earliest indicators of child's going down the road of conduct disorder. And if we don't address it early, it can easily escalate in severity and incidence against people. What do we know about pets and families? People who aren't in the animal field are often astounded by these figures. More American homes have pets than have children. We spend more money in this country on pet food than we do on baby food. There are more dogs in the United States than there are people in any country in Europe except Germany, and there are more cats in the US than there are dogs. Children's literature, their media, their vocabulary, the mobiles over their crib, their imprints on their pajamas, their video games, they're saturated with animals. And in fact, we did a content analysis of fairy tales and found fairy tales have more animals in them than fairies. For a child, and particularly a child in a distressed or dysfunctional household, that pet may be the only source of affection that's available 24/7. And the bottom line is the one that really intrigues me. Gail Melson, when she was at Purdue University, found that a child in America today is more likely to grow up with a pet than with a live-at-home father. And so for anybody looking at family dynamics or considering the family or working in family courts, if they're not including the presence of pets, think of the pieces of the puzzle that they're missing. And where do we find pets in American homes? Overwhelmingly in homes with children. More than 2/3 of homes with children under age 6 and almost 3/4 of homes with children over age 6 have pets. And who cares for them? Overwhelmingly, it's the woman in the household. The animal becomes just a surrogate, a child. Well, there are a couple of things about that. First, getting back to the veterinarian, who's the vet going to see on Saturday morning? Invariably, it's mom with a couple of kids bringing the animal in for treatment. So the veterinarian has the potential to see 3 potential victims of family violence. And the other thing here is that the women and the children have these strong emotional bonds with their pets, which make the animals soft targets for abusers, and it makes women and children particularly vulnerable to family violence. But the law, of course, has to treat this differently. Even though 99% of us consider our pets to be either members of the family or close companions, legally they are property. They're in the exact same legal category as a toaster, but no abused woman ever ran back to her abuser to rescue her toaster. But they do go back 8 times, is the current average before she finally leaves for good, to rescue their animals because they're afraid of what will happen to their animals. And in fact, when animal abuse is involved, we've got research that shows there are often as many as 50 prior incidents before she's able to leave for good. And we all know there are many reasons why she doesn't leave, but the fear for the animal's welfare is an enormous barrier. Our view of pets has changed. We see this in disasters all the time. Just last month here in Western North Carolina, but we first really saw it with Hurricane Katrina back in 2005, where people just won't get off the rooftop and get onto the rescue helicopter unless they can take their pets with them. One of the things that came out of Katrina was the Pet Evacuation and Transportation Standards Act, which makes FEMA funding available for pet relief as well during disasters. We saw that first time with Superstorm Sandy. There was the New Jersey National Guard rescuing Old English sheepdogs. They're still out there doing this kind of work with current disasters as well. And this is a global phenomenon. I was doing some lecturing in Japan a number of years ago. It was shortly after Fukushima. And we can't imagine the devastation these people went through, but they took their pets with them. And I love the two bottom pictures there. The one in the middle is a woman getting her dog tested for radiation with a Geiger counter. And the bottom one is an elderly woman in a refugee center feeding her dog grains of rice with chopsticks. And this is what we call the human-animal bond, and it's absolutely most powerful. Well, what about pets in military families? And the fact is, we really don't know an awful lot, but what we do know is very revealing. There have only been a handful of studies, and we certainly need much more research on this. But what we know, and these studies are 40 years old, and we just haven't, had anybody replicate these much, more recently. But you can see the numbers there. Most military families had pets growing up. They believe their children should have pets. They visit civilian and military veterinarians. They celebrate their pets' birthdays. They display their pets' pictures at home. Main reason for not having pets is limitations on military housing. And I love this number here, 8% of people said bringing a pet into the home would increase the amount of arguing, but 9% said it would decrease the amount of arguing. Of course, pets limit their ability to travel, but look at the benefits to affection and happiness and fun and causing the family to spend time together. No different than civilian families. When are pets important in military households? All these numbers are considerably higher than for comparable civilian families. So pets play an extremely important role in military homes when the family's sad or depressed or lonely, when the service member is PCSing or overseas or temporarily deployed on a TDY somewhere, for their companionship, for relaxation, to help the children. And people take their pets with them when they move. Again, these numbers are 40 years old, but even back then you can see, almost 3/4 of military families will take their pets with them when they're transferred stateside. Almost half will do it even when they go overseas. This has created all sorts of issues, and the Department of Defense created a new policy in 2024 offering reimbursement to families to transfer one pet with them when they have a PCS, a permanent change of station. $550 if it's domestic, $2,000 if it's international. But then the Centers for Disease Control came up with a new policy because they're afraid of animals coming into the country from overseas that might be bringing rabies. So now it's extremely difficult for military families to bring their pets back to the U.S. Unless they pay for private transfer, which gets to be very expensive. And we're still waiting to see how that shakes out. Pets affect military morale and military readiness. The one study that we had on this was extremely revealing. Service members say that families experience emotional trauma when they're separated from their pets. No big surprise there. This can lead to family problems, poor adaptation to new environments, and even animosity towards the service. The unconditional love and regard that people get from their pets is intensified when the military service member has to leave for extended periods of time. 96% of families who left their pets behind when they transferred, had at least one family member with temporary or chronic sadness. It's a huge morale issue. What does this mean for family court judges, whether civilian or military? It's very simple. When you think of family, however you define family, include the pets. There is no uniform American family anymore, as we all know. But if we take this model here and change it and define the family like this and just automatically ask if there are pets there and what their relationship is, you will get an amazing window into the world of everybody in that home. It's a tremendous way to gain rapport, and gain information. I'll come back to that in a bit. What do we know about abuse in military families? We know that female military personnel are more likely to be sexually assaulted by fellow servicemen than to be killed in combat. And we also know that service members who go overseas in combat zones undergoing inordinate amounts of stress, and they come back not only with TDI, but PTSD. That elevated stress when they return changes their whole relationship, and it can have potentially devastating consequences for some families and can lead to a rise in family violence and abuse. Domestic violence in military families has some unique attributes to it above and beyond what we see in the civilian life. First of all, the military calls the spouses dependents, and they are literally dependent on the service member for just about everything: their housing, their insurance, their money, their social life. The frequent relocations of military households causes social dislocations. They don't get a chance to make long-term connections with their neighbors as civilian families might do. I'm not sure if this is still accurate, whether base courts and domestic violence protection orders exist only at the discretion of a base commander. Then I'm not sure if all bases have them yet. But in any event, the spouse, again, usually a woman, in a domestic violence situation, is afraid to report suspected, family violence, because to do so is going to affect the service member's career, which affects his rank, which affects the pay that the whole family depends on. There may be language barriers. Military bride may not necessarily speak English as a first language. As with the civilian world, most domestic violence offenders are young men, and in the case of the military, they're in the lower ranks. In the military, they have great training in using weapons and access to weapons, and a propensity for violence when necessary. Frequent deployments make it difficult for service members to adjust to the normalcy of a family environment, when they return from the intense combat zone or the camaraderie of their unit when when they've been transferred. And of course, service member may be dealing with his own traumas, and the family routine is kind of boring and violence can lash out. Animal abuse, like in the civilian world, was largely ignored for the longest time. And it wasn't until 2016 that animal cruelty, neglect, and bestiality or animal sex abuse was included in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It's only been illegal in the Army for 8 years now. And there are two articles, Article 134 and Article 125, that pertain to this. Also, Article 128 is kind of interesting. Harming an animal, is within the military's definition of domestic violence. We have 11 states now that have similar provisions, which is an intriguing way to look at animal cruelty when it's used as an intimidating factor in domestic violence. What do we mean by this weird animal called animal cruelty? Well, if beauty's in the eye of the beholder, so is ugliness, and so is cruelty. There is no uniform definition. There are many socially volatile issues that we as a society just haven't reached consensus on yet. What we're talking about with the link is not whether everybody should become a vegetarian and get rid of factory farming or banning biomedical experiments or fur coats. Those are animal rights issues. We put them in the parking lot. We're talking about the individual acts of abuse, cruelty, and neglect to individual animals, and there is no uniform definition. Best definition I ever saw was in a British veterinary dictionary: the infliction of pain or distress unnecessarily. And every state law has a qualifier in there about necessary or unnecessary, and that varies, situationally. And it's usually up to the courts to take a look at every single case and handle it on a case-by-case basis, which makes it extremely difficult for judges looking for a clear-cut resolution. The fact is, what the public sees, what the profession sees, and what the law says can vary widely. What the next door neighbor complains about, what the animal's owner says, what the veterinarian reports, what the animal cruelty investigator finds, what the prosecutor determines to charge, and what the court finally rules on are 6 completely different standards. And complicating matters further, when we're dealing with child protection, adult protection, or domestic violence, there's a uniform system. There's a state agency. It's under the federal government with child and adult protection, or law enforcement handles domestic violence cases. It's clear cut. There is absolutely no uniform standard for investigating animal cruelty cases because it's all done on the local level by local humane societies or SPCAs or the police or the sheriff or animal services or animal control. They all operate independently with widely varying capacity and skills and funding, and then widely varying ranges of prosecution. And so it's just a whole mess, to be perfectly honest with you. Um, and then most reports that come in to whoever investigates in a community are cases of neglect, which may be inadvertent, usually based on extenuating circumstances, may not necessarily warrant prosecution. Typical statutes, and every state has its own, and they're not standard. There are basically four types, and the FBI finally codified this into their new system. It's called NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System. So we're starting to get national data on animal cruelty incidents for the first time. Okay, and so they have four distinct types. Okay, this doesn't necessarily mean state laws follow that. The most common form is animal neglect or gross neglect, which is animal hoarding. Physical abuse of animals, or as we like to think of it, non-accidental injury, modeled after the child protection laws. Organized abuse is dogfighting and cockfighting. Animal sexual abuse. There is no crime of emotional abuse as there is with domestic child or elder abuse. There's no such crime as emotional abuse when it comes to animals. Best resource for this, contact us at the National Link Coalition. We'll help you. But you can also go to animallaw.info. It's a website from the Animal Law Research Center at Michigan State University, and you can see your state's statutes there if you're not already familiar with them through your own sources there. Why are people cruel to animals? Simple answer, for the same reasons they're cruel to other people, but it gets very, very complicated. It could be ignorance. They just don't have know the proper skills for good animal husbandry. They might be socialized to abuse. They come from a culture where violence is the way that they solve their problems. And it's like with domestic violence, it's all about power and control. They just don't have any empathy for the animal's feelings. They may be people under enormous pressure from other issues, and the pet's behavior releases their frustration and the anger, and the dog's pooping on the carpet is the last straw. And they take their anger out at the most convenient target, and whether that target has two legs or four is a matter of convenience as much as anything else. They'll harm animals to threaten or intimidate or control somebody else, whether it's, a domestic violence or child sexual abuse situation, or to retaliate against a neighbor for some other unrelated issue. They'll target the animals. They use negative reinforcement techniques to train the animal, not realizing that hitting the dog or the cat does not work as well as rewarding it when it does something right. And then there are the psychopaths out there who get sexual gratification or sadistic thrills to enhance their own sense of aggression and when they harm an animal. Why are children cruel to animals? For all those same reasons, plus some others, and you can see just a general list of our increasing concerns for these. It might start out with just curiosity or just exploring, just not knowing any different. They may be coerced by a gang leader to torture an animal as a gang initiation rite. We have cases of teenagers who torture animals because they're bored, and then they'll watch videos of that later when they get depressed. They'll retaliate against an animal because they're afraid of it. We've had cases of kids smothering their own pets just to protect them from being tortured by the abuser in the household. We have cases of kids killing animals or hurting animals just to reenact what's happened to them or to regain a sense of power after they've been abused. They'll imitate what they see the grown-ups in their lives doing. And worst case scenario, it's a dress rehearsal for acts of interpersonal violence. So you can see we need to take this seriously. Animal cruelty often identifies other criminal activities. One study in Chicago found 35% of search warrants for animal abuse or dogfighting wound up in seizing illegal narcotics or weapons. 82% of these offenders had priors. 31% of teens in certain neighborhoods have attended dogfights. Roll that one around in your mind for a minute. Animal cruelty often exposes other family violence and other social issues. The perpetrators pose a risk to themselves and to others. Interestingly enough, the witnesses and the victims are much more comfortable talking about it than they are talking about what happened to them. And they don't, with the case of the perps, they don't realize they're copying to a crime. They will brag about harming animals because they think it makes them sound more macho. Animal cruelty often begins early in childhood. And of course, the bottom line is it inflicts pain and suffering on the victims. It's a public health issue. One study was looking at, we have an issue called BSL, breed-specific legislation. A lot of communities are trying to ban pit bulls in particular, and I don't want to get sidetracked on that. But Gary Petronic, when he was at the vet school at Tufts University, looked at every dog bite fatality in the United States over a 10-year period. There were 256 cases. He found the overwhelming common denominator in more than 1/5 of these cases wasn't the animal's breed. It was the fact that the animals had been abused or neglected. They fought back the only way they could, with their teeth. It's a huge threat in domestic violence. There was a study in Nashville a number of years ago. Nashville was seeing a big spike in domestic violence, femicides, and women who were being killed. And they decided to try something, a triage system that when people called the crisis line, they identified 3 factors that they determined were the biggest risk for women dying. Okay. Has he threatened suicide? Does he have access to a weapon? And has he threatened to mutilate or kill the pets? And if she answered yes to any of those, they put a special intervention in place. I don't know what that intervention was. Okay. What we know is that after 1 year, the number of calls coming into the hotline increased 50%. And we don't know whether that means there was more domestic violence or just better reporting systems. But even with a 50% increase in calls coming in, the number of fatalities decreased 80%. That's how significant a risk factor this is in domestic violence. Common wisdom says animal cruelty is always leads to domestic violence. Kids who kick the cat are going to grow up to become serial killers. Study in Massachusetts wanted to look at that. And they looked at 153 people who'd been convicted of animal cruelty, and they tracked their criminal records for 10 years before and 10 years afterwards to see if they had any other crimes. And they matched them with a control group. And what they found was kind of interesting. The first part didn't surprise them. They found the animal abusers were far more likely to have other criminal histories than the control group who were non-animal abusers. But the second part surprised them. It turns out in the majority of cases, the other crimes came first. So psychologically speaking, there are 2 ways of looking at this. It can be the graduation hypothesis, where people start out hurting animals and then move on to hurting people because they need bigger and bigger thrills. But more likely than not, it's a pattern of general social deviance, and it's part of a whole constellation of antisocial behaviors. So the animal abuse doesn't always lead to human violence. It can follow it. We shouldn't be surprised, however they're connected, because there is a link. A couple of case studies to show you what this looks like in real life. This was a case in suburban Philadelphia, Montgomery County, bitterly cold night in January. The neighbors were concerned about the welfare of a Great Dane in a homemade doghouse in the snowy backyard there. They called the police. Police in turn called the Montgomery County SPCA. They took the dog away. Police went inside the house and found a dead 6-year-old boy who had been beaten to death for looking at somebody while they went to the bathroom. The tenant was Reverend Javin McBurrows. He and his wife fled to Atlanta, were eventually extradited, brought back to Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. He was tried and he got 22 years in prison. Several things, came out of this case. The first was there were 7 children in this household. 6 of the 7 children, there were 3 of their own and 4 foster kids. And don't ask me how they ever got into the foster care system. But 6 of the 7 children had been beaten at various times in their life. Secondly, was the animal case that was the trigger to bring the investigation in, again, because the abuse occurs outdoors. And third, 4 years prior to this, McBurrows had been convicted of domestic violence. And 4 years prior to that, he had been convicted of animal cruelty. And none of the agencies in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania were talking to each other. They were in their silos. Another case is in Philadelphia. As Sandra Rutolo explained to the judge, she was thinking of her dogs when she pulled the trigger. For 13 years, her husband battered her, but one night he not only whipped her with a vacuum cleaner cord, he grabbed one of her 4 German Shepherds and warned her that if she left, he would find her and slit the dog's throat in front of her. Later that night, as her husband slept, she loaded a 38 caliber pistol and pointed it at herself. A moment away from suicide, she looked at her eldest dog and said, "Duchess, if I die, what's going to happen to you?" So instead, she walked into her husband's bedroom and shot him. And she got 10 to 20 years for third-degree murder. I mean, that shows how animals are pawns in this power and control game of domestic violence. I don't have time to show you this video here. Unfortunately, if we have time at the end, I'll try to boot that up. This is what the cycle of violence looks like in a domestic violence setting. The abuser harms or threatens the animals. The survivors stay. The children are exposed to both domestic violence and animal abuse. They become violent or victims themselves, and they wind up to repeat the whole process all over again. You may or may not be familiar with what's called the Duluth model or the power and control wheel. This was developed by the Domestic Violence Agency in Duluth, Minnesota many years ago. At that point, everybody thought domestic violence was just physical violence. It isn't. It's all about power and control. And there may be physical abuse, but there are also these 8 forms of intimidation and emotional abuse that are embodied within the wheel. And I'll show you how the animals play a role in this. We have these coercions and threats where he says, "I did it to your cat, I can do it to you." Or the animal may just disappear one day as a way to send her a message. There's an isolation factor. The doggy park has replaced the village green, and when people get together with their animals, communication happens. We saw that during the pandemic lockdowns, where for many people, the only time they got out to meet their neighbors was walking their dogs down the street. He'll refuse to allow her to do that, or refuse to allow her to take the dog or the cat or the gerbil to the veterinarian and keep her from getting that socialization that occurs when people talk about their pets. There's emotional abuse. He'll call her a bitch or other derogatory animal names. He'll take the pet away to remove what may be the only source of emotional comfort and unconditional love that she has. He may force her to watch animal pornography or even have sex with the animals as a way to further humiliate her. There's economic abuse. He'll refuse to allow her to spend money on the animal's food or vet care and then blame her when the animal gets sick. There's this intimidation factor saying, "I did it to your cat, I can do it to you." The children will get dragged into this. He'll harm or kill the children's pets and then blame mommy, use that as a way to drive a wedge between her and the kids. As with everything else, he'll deny it, he'll blame somebody else. And then there's the legal problem. Who owns this animal? If animals are property, who's going to get the dog or the cat or the fish or whatever in a bitter custody dispute if this domestic violence devolves into divorce? And I'll tell you how we're solving that problem here. We found that pet abuse is one of the 4 biggest risk indicators for somebody becoming a domestic violence abuser. The first 3 risk factors didn't surprise people, the researchers. Low education levels, history of mental health problems, history of substance abuse. But the 4th risk factor is this history of animal abuse. Andrew Campbell's great work in Indianapolis is finding that when animal abuse co-occurs with domestic violence, the risk of death to first responders, which is always high in a domestic violence scenario, but that risk doubles when there's both animal abuse and domestic violence. And the domestic violence is more hands-on and more dangerous. You can see the numbers there, the victims who'd been strangled, and we all know what kind of a risk factor strangulation is in domestic violence. 70% of these guys had access to a firearm. A quarter of these women had been forced to have sex with a guy. More than 3/4 of them feared that they would be killed. They feared for their lives. I mentioned this survey earlier, the callers to the hotline, about the women saying, they wouldn't leave home without their pets. Interestingly enough, and tragically enough, 48% feared the abuser would harm or kill the pets. 30% said the kids had witnessed it or were aware of it. And almost three-quarters of these women were not aware that there are now some 300 pet-friendly domestic violence shelters across the U.S. And I'll give you a resource for that here in a little bit. Study in Utah found almost three-quarters of women in shelters reported the animals were hurt or threatened. And again, almost one-third said their children had hurt or killed the animals. This is that intergenerational cycle of violence. Study in Wisconsin found the animal abuse overwhelmingly occurs in the presence of women and children to intimidate them. Why do the abusers target animals? This was from a study in New Zealand, and I cite this to show this is truly a global issue. It normalizes a culture of violence in that household. It holds the family hostage. It's a way to get revenge not only against her, but also against family or friends who help her escape. They'll do it because they're jealous, because she's more emotionally attached and has more attention towards the pet than she does to him. And they do it and they brag about it because they think the cops don't care. And in many cases, unfortunately, they are right. They hurt the animals because they can, because they're convenient, and because it works. Animal abuse is a wake-up call. We all know there are many reasons why she doesn't leave, why she keeps going back. She says it was my fault, or he's getting better, or he didn't mean to hurt me. We need to be telling these women, look, if he's hurting harmless animals, it's not your fault, it's his fault. It's not the cat's fault, it's his fault. And it's time to make a safety plan for you and the kids and the pets and get out of there. I mentioned the early history of child abuse. Henry Berg founded the ASPCA, the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, way back in 1866 in New York City. And a mere 8 years later, he was asked to intervene on behalf of little Mary Ellen Wilson, an abused little girl. And the laws of the time said children were property, as animals were. He had this brilliant idea that if a horse was entitled to some legal protection, so should a child. And he managed to get a writ of habeas corpus, got the girl extracted from the home. The family was prosecuted. She became the first ward of the state in the child protection system. And until the 1960s, many humane societies and SPCAs had this dual function of protecting both animals and children. That began to change, and I trace it to this article that appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1962, written by Henry Kemp and his colleagues in Denver, pediatricians, defining this new terminology called the battered child syndrome. That term didn't exist before 1962. Prior to that time, when kids showed up in ERs with bruises and injuries, the kids were called accident prone. But by calling it a syndrome, by having medical terminology, by having the American Medical Association sanctioning, the idea that physicians have a duty and responsibility to evaluate the problem and report it, that led to the National Child Protection System that we have today. And animal shelters went back to just protecting animals, but today the link is bringing that back together again and connecting those dots. A little bit of research on the animal abuse, child abuse connection there. One of the most vivid studies was done in New Jersey, looking at families who were being investigated for child abuse. 60% of them also had neglected or abused pets. And when it was physical child abuse, the rate of animal abuse was a whopping 88%. Two-thirds of the animal abuse incidents were perpetrated by the man, but as we saw in those other studies, one-third were by the kids themselves. Two other statistics came out of this study that I always find fascinating. There were 11 times more dog bites in these homes where there's both child abuse and animal abuse going on. The animals respond to violence with violence. And these families see veterinarians similar to the general population. Okay, so when veterinarians tell us, hey, I'm never going to see an abused kid, that's not true. They will. I mentioned the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences. There's a huge gap in the system. The study found that toxic stress in early childhood harms the child's developing brain architecture, which leads to long-term hyper-responsiveness to perceived threats, which leads to people adopting lifelong mental and physical health issues that not only lead to emotional distress over the course of the lifespan, but shorten that lifespan, and it causes greater mortality and early death. Not once in that massive study did they ever include the possibility that a child's committing or witnessing animal cruelty could, in fact, be an adverse childhood experience. A little bit about the elder abuse link there. People working with seniors in courts or elsewhere are often dealing with a population with several stereotypical concerns. There may be memory loss from Alzheimer's or dementia or other mental illness issues. They're usually on fixed or low income. They have limited transportation. They're socially isolated, physical weakness and frailty. They may be animal hoarders. I said hoarders could be any age group, but they tend to be elderly populations. And these lead to a number of issues affecting their animals. The pets are often neglected. These people may love their pets dearly. They may be very strongly bonded to them, but because of those constraints that I mentioned earlier, they're just unable to afford food or vet care. Or they'll flip that around and we have self-neglect. They'll spend what limited money they have on their pets, but not themselves. So we have people eating pet food or people just being malnourished while their pets are happy and healthy. Or they just won't go into hospital or long-term care because there's nobody to care for their pets. The emotional attachment that seniors have to their pets can be incredible. This may be the last link to a spouse who passed away. This may be the only excuse he has to get up in the morning and get out of the house and go for a walk. This may be the only excuse she has to have a sense of purpose to feed the cat every day and change the litter box. We have safety and health issues. Many seniors are denied services because the home health aides or the caseworkers are afraid to go into that house because there are dangerous animals or it's overrun with cockroaches or mice because the cat food tins have piled up in the sink for weeks at a time or their litter box just has never been changed. We have cases of financial exploitation. In one case in Rhode Island, I recall, guy held his elderly mother's cat hostage for $20,000 in ransom money. We have issues affecting disabled people where the spouse or partner is jealous of the other person's extreme dependence on their service animal. And then animal hoarding, and the recidivism rate is 100%. It's extremely complex. We have not found a cure for it. So what can you do with all this? Fill in the pieces of the puzzle. Asking about victims' relationships with their animals improves your assessments and decisions. It builds rapport, and it amplifies your sense of caring. Animals slip under the radar of human defense mechanisms. You know as well as anybody, people coming before the court or the probation officer or the investigator or the Children's Advocacy Center or whatever, are scared, their barriers are up, their defenses are up. And if we ask them 3 questions about their animals, it softens that fear, their barriers come down, and it can open a window into the families or the person's underlying issues. So we suggest asking these 3 questions. Are there animals at home? How are they cared for? Are you worried about their welfare? It's a great information and rapport building tool to find out what's really going on in that house. How are we responding to this? Well, we're encouraging social service agencies, the courts, and military family advocacy programs, among other agencies, again, to ask about the presence and the relationship of the pets, to be aware of dangerous animals that might threaten a child's welfare, treat the loss of a pet, the death or disappearance of it, as a developmental issue. And don't just say, oh, you'll get another cat, or it was only a dog, we'll find you another one. It can be as devastating as the loss of a human member of the family. Identify who in the community can help with animal issues. There are animal care and control agencies, veterinarians in private practice and on military bases. Most people just don't know who to call to report an animal issue. So we came up with our national directory of abuse investigation agencies, and we call it the Abuse Busters campaign because, it could be the SPCA or Humane Society, could be animal control or animal services, could be police or sheriff, could be nobody's really doing it. If you go to our website, nationallinkcoalition.org, you will see 50 pages with listing 6,500 cities and counties and who to call to report child abuse, where there's usually just one number, domestic violence, where there's usually one, maybe two numbers, elder abuse, where there's one or two numbers, and animal abuse, where there could be 600 different numbers in particular states. Good legislation coming down the pike with this. This started in Maine in 2006, and now we have 40 states, plus the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, in which courts can specifically include pets, and in many cases livestock as well, in domestic violence protection from abuse orders. They could always include it just as an afterthought, but now it's codified in 40 states, okay, that they can include the animals in the protection order. So if you're in a civilian court in any of these states, you can do it. And we have the whole list of states and the specific statutory references. Feel free to contact us if you need more background on that. We also have this on the federal level, the Pet and Women's Safety Act, which allows these protection orders to be enforced interstate. So if a woman with a protection order in Missouri goes to South Dakota, okay, and the guy comes after the pet there, it's still in effect. And also, the PAWS Act is making $3 million a year in federal funding available to domestic violence shelters to build facilities to be able to house animals belonging to the human victims. I mentioned animal abuse defined as domestic violence. I misspoke before. It's not 11 states, it's 19 states. And these are the states there with the statutory references. And again, we can give you all of this. But in 19 states, coercive control of animal abuse is defined as domestic violence, stalking, or coercion. And in 2 states, it's defined as an act of elder abuse. And this concept is going global. We're seeing similar laws in the UK, Spain, and 5 states in Australia right now. Who gets the dog in a divorce case? We now have 8 states in which the courts in a divorce settlement can rule on the property disposition of the animal. They can do that anywhere, but in these 8 states, they can do it based on what's best for the animal, what's in the animal's best interest. And so we have this in Alaska and California and Illinois and New York, Delaware, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Maine, and Washington, D.C. Just like a child custody case, what's in the child's best interest, what's in the animal's best interest. And again, we can give you statutory references on all those. Way back when that vet said, why would I report animal cruelty? I might lose a client. Well, today we have 43 states in which veterinarians are either mandated or permitted to report suspected animal abuse to the appropriate authorities. The states in blue is where they're mandated. The states in green is where they're permitted. The states with a check mark, they have immunity from civil and or criminal liability and or professional sanctions from making a report in good faith. We still have 7 states to go, and we'd love to get some judges in these 7 states to help carry this one step further. Sex with animals used to be considered just the normal thing that people did on farms. Well, because of the connection with child sexual abuse, it's now illegal in 49 states and Guam and Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands and the UCMJ. It's still legal for some bizarre reason in West Virginia. Don't ask me why. States in blue, it's a felony. States in gray, it's a felony on a subsequent offense. States in light blue, it's a misdemeanor, but at least it's illegal in 49 states now. If anybody here is in West Virginia, we'd love to get some legislative support to change the law there. Back in the early 90s, when we first started talking about the link, animal cruelty was only a felony level crime in 5 states. Today, all 50 states have some form of animal cruelty listed as a felony. Not all of them. There are a lot of cases where it's misdemeanors or petty offenses, and doesn't mean it's always prosecuted, but at least on the books, it's a felony. Something is a felony in all 50 states. We have a growing number of animal cruelty enforcement units and prosecution units across the country. Because these cases are so complex and multidisciplinary and involve so many different areas, and because there are so many cases, it's not unusual in a large city for there to be 5,000 or more animal cruelty investigations in the course of a year. And to help judges and courts deal with this, we now have a field called veterinary forensics, and we're training hundreds of veterinarians now to be animal crime scene investigators. It's animal CSI using the same techniques that county medical examiners and human forensic specialists have used for years in criminal cases, applying this to cases of animal cruelty. We're encouraging domestic violence agencies to regularly include pets in their safety planning procedures. We have a number of safety planning guidelines in our resources section on our website. One of the best ones comes from the Urban Resource Institute in New York City. 4 basic areas. Have a pet care plan so that you know what you're going to do when you leave, who's going to take care of the pets. Have all the animal ownership documents handy, and we're encouraging domestic violence survivors to get all the protection in her name. Okay. So if it does come down to a custody dispute, she'll have an easier time of proving she's the best caretaker. Have a go-to bag that includes the animal supplies ready to go, and get all the paperwork, like I said, in her name. We now have what I whimsically call over 300 doggy witness protection programs. We have over 300 domestic violence shelters that now accept pets. This was a program started by a former prosecutor, Allie Phillips, in Michigan. There's her website at safetyprogram.org, stands for Sheltering Animals and Families Together. And she's got a manual and a guidebook to help domestic violence shelters become pet friendly. And there's money available, not only through the Fed's program through the PAWS Act, but Red Rover has a program with Purina. It's called the Purple Leash Program, and they can award grants of up to $60,000 to help domestic violence shelters remodel to be able to accept pets. We're seeing a lot of animal-assisted interventions that affect court personnel, both civilian and military. I mentioned Allie Phillips from Safety. She started this program years ago called Task Therapy Animals Supporting Kids, with guidelines for having therapy animals in children's advocacy centers and now family justice centers. Courthousedogs.org out of the Seattle area. They're the main force for putting therapy animals in courtrooms to deal with softening the impact on children who have to confront their abusers in a court case. Some specific services for military pets. There's a group called Dogs on Deployment. I refer to it as the other DOD. They help find foster families when military families have to deploy overseas. They advocate for pet owners' rights on domestic installations and have come up with financial assistance for military families during emergencies. There's another group called Pathways to Safety International. They have resources for families overseas, military and civilian, experiencing domestic violence, including facilities to take care of their pets. Another group called Leave No Paws Behind USA helps with transportation costs for military families doing a permanent change of station. The military aid societies all now have pet support services. The Air Force Aid Society, Army Emergency Relief, and the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society have financial assistance for military families during PCS, low interest loans, and grants for Veterans Administration service animals. So in summary, I hope we have a few minutes here for some Q&A. We have decades of research now linking animal cruelty and other family violence, the emotional attachments that women and children in particular have towards their pets make the animals soft targets for coercion and control. The animal abuse is one of the earliest warning signs of a family in trouble. The animal investigators in any community are the first responders and their first point of social services intervention. Asking about clients' pets or defendants' pets or plaintiffs' pets, whoever, It's a great way to gain their rapport and trust and find out what's going on. The better the courts understand the link, the better we are to prevent future violence and protect the community. And if we take stronger measures to prevent, prosecute, and punish animal cruelty, we certainly protect man's best friend, but we also protect man, and we really protect woman. Jennifer Wolf is a forensic veterinarian, one of the vet forensics people I mentioned earlier. She says the canary in the coal mine of an abusive home may literally be an abusive canary. By responding to the injury or death of that canary, we can potentially save many other pets and people. So that's a look at how we can connect the dots between these four forms of family violence and demonstrate what the link really is. Again, there's our website, there's our email address. Feel free to contact us if you'd like to get our link letter. I'm putting the November issue out today, even as we speak. I can get you into the November issue. And let me turn this over. I think Shayna or John is going to moderate the chat. I see we have a number of comments in there. And if anybody has some questions, I'd love to answer them.
Yes, so there was a question about, will we be getting a copy of this presentation? And so the recording of this Zoom will be posted on the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges website that Sherry posted in the chat. And then another question, great information. Do we have permission to use your information? Lorraine, you may need to expand on that a little bit.
Well, first of all, yes, you have permission. Okay, but if you want to explain, go ahead.
Yes, I would like to very much be able to give the information and get a copy of your PowerPoint. Is so well done and inform more people about this problem that we are having. I was wondering if we have permission to use your PowerPoint as a therapist to inform more people in our community that this is going on.
Yeah, send me an email and I'll send something back to you. You bet. But also, you'll have the recording of the PowerPoint on the National Council's website too.
Okay. And is there any possibility of watching the video that you promised that you would show us if you had the time?
If we can go a few minutes extra, I'm certainly willing.
Okay, I would love that. Thank you.
Okay. It's about a 4-minute video, that's all.
Oh, okay. Oh, thank
Before
you.
we do that, there's a couple of links in the chat that are resources with the National Council, in addition to what Sherry posted, where the recording is going to be available. The technical assistance bulletin that is referred to is very helpful and useful, a collaboration between the Animal Legal Defense Fund and the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. The others have to do with resources available to military families. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I should also mention I've submitted an article in the forthcoming special issue of the Family Court Journal. There's going to be a special issue coming out about military issues, and we'll have an article in there about all this.
Okay, Phil, there's another question. Do you work as an expert witness?
I'm not sure that I'm really qualified to do that. I don't have enough advanced degrees to qualify, but we can certainly refer specific people to you for specific cases, depending on what you need. Psychologists or veterinarians or, others with more specific expertise.
Okay. And another question, does the finding of domestic violence typically lead to the discovery of animal abuse?
I don't know whether it often does. Let's put it that way. We have a tremendous number of surveys showing the co-occurrence. It doesn't always happen. Again, if you go to our website, you'll see even more. I can bore you with even more statistics than what I came up with today. But yes, it often does. But we have to ask about it. And if you don't ask, you won't know. So it's really as simple as that. Most people don't think to ask about it because it's kind of an afterthought. It often does not show up in the screening questions that domestic violence shelters or law enforcement agencies use, and we're trying to change that just to automatically include it so we can come up with some better handle on the situation.
And for everyone, I just posted the website link for the National Link Coalition. And then Phil, is that your email address on this last slide right here?
Yes. Yes.
I will post that in the chat as well.
Okay. And if you want, I'll try to get this video up and running.
I think you should. I don't see any other questions in the chat.
Okay, let me see if I can do this here. I've got to do a new share. There we go. So let me see if this will play. Okay. This is not a dramatization. This is real. Her name is Tanya McLeod. This was done 13 years ago now, I think. Tanya was a victim of domestic violence, and her dog Brownie was targeted by the abuser, and she talked about it. At the time, she wished there was a place in New York City where she lives, that a shelter that also took pets. Today, there are, I believe, 9 shelters in New York City that are pet friendly, through the Urban Resource Institute. So the numbers are a little outdated, but the concept is still there. Let me see if you can pick this up here. The sound's a little muddled at the beginning. We'll to see how this works here.
I did consider leaving. That's all I dreamt about, day and night, night and day. My ex-husband brought Brownie home to me as a peace offering. In walks this beautiful, fun dog, puppy, and we were so happy. As I would take on the responsibility of walking Brownie, my ex-husband began to question me. Didn't you just walk him? I never expected that my ex-husband would use Brownie to control me or to abuse me, because I loved Brownie. And when he would yell at him or hit him or not feed him right away or not allow me to walk him, it hurt me. I felt as if Brownie was one of my children that I had to protect. But there was really nothing that I could do save getting choked or stomped on or hit with a bat. One morning I was awakened out of my sleep to horrible, horrible wrenching sounds of Brownie almost screaming. My ex-husband was ranting and raving about, oh, this dog doesn't listen, he's stupid, and, I'm going to put him out of his misery. So we went back and forth about who's going to walk Brownie, because I knew in my heart, if he walked Brownie, Brownie was not coming back. Animal abuse and domestic violence go hand in hand. If anyone is listening and who gets this, that there is a distinct connection between animal abuse and domestic violence, then we've begun the process of ending domestic violence. It starts somewhere with knowledge. A shelter would help, where a family who's going through crisis and who's trying to actually leave that abusive situation, but have pets, a place where they can go and take their pets and be safe, that's a start.
This is just a shorter extract of a longer video that was done by this group in New York, Connect NYC. What happened was he took Brownie for a walk. Brownie did not come back, but he came back covered in blood. And that was the last straw. Tanya left. She started her life all over again and became a very active spokeswoman for domestic violence and the animal abuse link. And it's one of the most dramatic videos about this situation that we've come across. Shayna or John, do we have any more questions there in the chat?
No, there are no more questions, just statements saying it's been a fantastic presentation. Well researched. So
Wonderful. We're glad to get the information out there, and we'd love to help anybody out there who's listening. We can do trainings, for your people. We can do in services. We can help you get the word out. We see judges as playing a major role in making changes in communities.
Bill, thank you very much on behalf of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. Thank you for all that you do, and we appreciate all of those who tuned in to this webinar, and a lot of resources that have been provided to you. Feel free to reach out both to Phil and the National Link Coalition, as well as to the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges for the work done with military families, along with the human-animal bond and how that all relates to the link that Phil's been teaching us about. Thank you all very much. And Phil, we appreciate you very much. Thank you.